Hello, everyone. I'm Jess, and I am the events coordinator at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I would like to welcome you to PNP Live. Thank you for joining us in this virtual format in the midst of these continuously extraordinary times, throughout all of which we strive to continue to bring you the authors you love and their new books to our Politics and Prose community. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting on the Politics and Prose website. Additionally, you can ask the author a question by clicking on Q&A, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And while we'll try to get to everyone's questions, we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. We are also providing closed captions. If you click on CC link right next to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Finally, we want to thank you for being here with us today. We're so thankful to our family of loyal customers keeping our business and our spirits afloat. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Clare Pooley graduated from Cambridge University and then spent 20 years in the heady world of advertising before becoming a full-time writer. Her debut novel, The Authenticity Project, was a New York Times bestseller and has been translated into 29 languages. Pooley lives in Fulham, London, with her husband, 3 children, and 2 border terriers. Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting is her second novel. Clare will be joined in conversation by Lori Frankel, the New York Times bestselling award-winning author of 4 novels, including her most recent 1, 2, 3, and This Is How It Always Is. Her writing has also appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Publishers Weekly, People Magazine, Lit Hub, the Sydney Morning Herald, and other publications. She is the recipient of the Washington State Book Award and Endeavor Award. Her novels have been translated into more than 25 languages and been optioned for film and TV. A former college professor, she now writes full-time in Seattle, Washington, where she lives with her family and makes good soup. Please welcome Clare Pooley and Lori Frankel to PNP Live.
Awesome. Thank you, Jess. Hi, Clare.
Hi, it's so good to be here. I'm actually all the way in Fulham, London right now. So yeah.
I know it feels very far away for me, and because I'm all the way in Seattle, so I'm also so no one is in DC. Well, I guess Jess is in DC, and maybe lots of the people listening, joining us are in DC. But I've only just had coffee. It's very early here, so I think, oh, you've made it to the end of the day, which is really a wonderful thing.
I'm in your future.
You are my future. Which I love it. It's really great to see you. I'm a huge fan. I loved this book. I think it is a very perfect book for right now in lots and lots of ways, which we're going to talk about all of them. I just want to say to everybody, thank you so much for being here. I am thrilled that we're still able to do these virtual events so that we can be, spread out all over the globe and still do this. But so if you have questions, ask them in the Q&A and we'll get there. I think that Claire and I are not going to have any trouble talking for the next 6 or 12 hours. So we will not do that. We'll have some chit-chatting and some reading. We will save time for Q&A. I promise to shut up in a little while. So as you think of them, put them in there and we'll get to them. And we're really glad that you're here. So excellent. Okay, so before we even get to Iona, which we shall, I wanted to start with the other part of the title, which is the commuting, because it strikes me that trains are such an important part of culture in the UK and in London, and Americans kind of suck at trains. So I feel like just by way of introduction, we might need the we might need like the introduction to train life, and also. And probably more pointedly, why this seemed like a good place to set a book to you? Why you chose to set the book there?
Yeah, I mean, commuting is a huge part of life in the UK, and I live in London, and millions of people commute in and out of central London every day, or certainly did before the pandemic. Things have changed a bit, obviously.
Right.
And this book is set pre-pandemic, so it's in those now what seems like a much more innocent era when we all used to crowd into sort of public transport without masks and without worrying about what we might catch. So commuting is a very big deal here. And, you know, I spent years commuting by bus and by train and by tube. And what I realized very quickly, and what every Londoner knows, is that there are rules about commuting, but like everything British, you know, those rules are often not, they're not written down, and they're not sort of said, they're just understood. And the very, you know, the most important rule of commuting is that you never talk to anybody else on the train. And you don't even make eye contact, actually, because even that's seen as being a bit sort of intrusive and a bit weird. So that's the sort of background to it. And, you know, it's funny because you see the same people on your commute often over and over again. You never talk to them, but you do make assumptions about them, often heinous assumptions. You give and you imagine what their lives are like when they're not on the commute. And to answer the second part of your question, which is why set a story there, you know, I was writing during the pandemic, and I found it really hard being stuck in a little box. And I found that, you know, I was really missing the stimulation of not just seeing friends and family, but being around complete strangers. And I found myself sort of yearning for those commuting days in a really bizarre way. And, you know, and I started thinking, what would have happened if I had broken that cardinal rule of the London commute, and I had talked to some of those strangers on the train? You know, what might that have led to? And really, that was a starting point for this book.
I love it. I love that. Maybe in the Q&A, people can think later about the metro in DC versus what is happening in this book, which feels really different for me. I used to commute on the metro in DC, and it's nothing like commuting in London. No, people don't talk and they don't look at each other, and yet it feels really, really different to me. And I don't know whether enough people have. It's true that I'm very smug. I got an advanced copy of this book, so I've had more time to think about it. People will have to email us later and tell me how it feels the same and how different to them. Do you want to maybe read to us just a little bit so we can get the feel of the train before we plunge in?
I tell you what I'll read the sort of at the incident that happens in the very first chapter, which is the incident that gets these commuters who have been taking the same train as each other for a long time but have never spoken to each other. It's the incident that gets them talking, because I figured that it had to be something quite dramatic. You know, any small thing is not going to break through that British reserve. Right? So it had to be something big. So this is what happens at the end of chapter 1. The heroine of one of the main characters, and the probably my favorite in the book, is Iona Iverson, the titular Iona, and she is on this train, the same train she takes every morning to work, the 8:05 from Hampton Court Station to Waterloo Station. Here we go. An unfamiliar noise made Iona look up. She recognized the man sitting in front of her. He wasn't usually on this train, but she often saw him on her return journey on the 1817 from Waterloo. She'd noticed him because of his exquisite tailoring, which ordinarily she would have admired, but it was rather ruined by an extraordinary sense of entitlement that only comes from being white, male, heterosexual, and excessively solvent. This was evidenced by his penchant for manspreading and talking extremely loudly on his mobile phone about the markets and positions. She'd once heard him refer to his wife as the ball and chain. He'd always got off at Surbiton, which struck her as a little incongruous. She gave all the passengers she recognized pet names, and he was smart but sexist manspreader. Right now, he didn't look quite so pleased with himself. If anything, he seemed in distress. He was leaning forward, clutching at his throat and emitting a volley of sounds somewhere between a cough and a vomit. The girl sitting next to him, a pretty young thing with red hair and a plait and dewy skin that she no doubt took for granted, but one day, remember fondly, said rather nervously, Are you okay? He was quite obviously not okay. He looked up, trying to communicate something to him, but his words, something to them, but his words seemed jammed in his throat. He gestured towards a half-eaten fruit salad on the table in front of him. I think he's choking on one of his strawberries, or maybe a grape, said the girl. This was obviously an emergency. It hardly mattered precisely which piece of fruit was involved. The girl put down the book she was reading and patted him on the back between his shoulder blades. It was a sort of gentle pat that was often accompanied by the words, good dog, and not at all what the situation required. Here, do it harder, said Iona, leaning forward across the table and giving him a hefty thump with a closed fist, which she found rather more enjoyable than she should have done, given the circumstances. For a moment, there was silence, and she thought he was better, but then the choking noise started again. His face had turned a mottled purple, and his lips had started to lose their colour. Was he going to die right here on the 805 before they even got to Waterloo?
Okay, first of all, I just want to assure everyone who hasn't read the book yet that it's just that funny and delightful all the way through. And I'm really glad you decided to read, because it's better in your voice than the one in my head. You do a beautiful job of reading, and it's really great. I also was so struck by, this is the magnitude of what has to happen to get people to talk, is that he's like literally rendered unable to talk, and that's the only thing that breaks the silence for these folks.
Well, I have to tell you that this was inspired by a real incident on my commute. So this was many years ago. I was on the London Underground and going into work in the morning. And there was this guy sitting opposite me, and because in the London Underground, you're in two rows facing each other. And he was sitting opposite me, and he was really smart, a bit like smart but sexist manspreader. You know, he was wearing a really tailored suit. He looked really, really rich and sort of, well put together, but he looked really ill. He looked like he'd been out on a big bender the night before and had a terrible hangover. And he starts going like this, and I thought, oh my God, he's going to be sick. And he was sweating, and he'd gone green, and everybody is looking at him thinking, what's about to happen. And he doesn't say anything. He just picks up his briefcase, which I think you probably call an attaché case. Is that right?
A briefcase is good.
Briefcase.
Yeah.
He picks up his briefcase, like smart leather briefcase, puts it on his lap, opens it up, vomits into it. Then he closes it again, picks it up, and walks off the tube, carrying a suitcase full of sick. And nobody said anything. And I thought, well, if that sort of instance still doesn't get people talking, I mean, we started exchanging glances a bit, but that was it. So it would take more than a vomiting incident. So I went for near death.
Yes. Okay. Interesting. That's really funny. Like you've run the experiment, and vomiting was just not enough. We had to run it out.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was just in New York and noticing riding the subway there that people are when I was there, we're still pretty spread out, and how different that is than when we were all together. But that it takes someone to sneeze, and that's actually medical panic enough at this point, that coughing quietly behind your mask is actually plenty to clear a car, which is also.
Yeah, and it's awful if you feel like, I went to the theatre recently, and I remember sort of at one point feeling like I really needed to cough, and you think, I can't, it's sort of, it's such a taboo these days. But but the fun thing is, so having seen that instant from Iona's perspective, the structure of the book sort of flips from one perspective to another. So you then see the same instant from the perspective of Piers, the man who's choking, and then from the perspective of the person who saves his life. So, and so what's quite fun is actually playing with the and the reason I love the sort of train construct is you get to play with the preconceptions that they all have with each other, and you understand, you start to see how each of them sees each of the others in a very different way.
Yes. So you start with their preconceptions, which are some right, but mostly wrong. And then they get to know each other, and we get to know them. You do this beautiful thing with these huge casts of characters. You did this in your last novel too, and it's a really I mean, it's, first of all, it's a remarkable way to tell a story, because we keep going from one person to the next person to the next person's point of view. That's how they're getting to know each other, and that's how we're getting to know them. You want to talk a little bit about both what draws you to these big casts of wonderful characters, and also how you manage to develop them all, as well as give them a story to tell?
Sure. I mean, I think where it started is I'm fascinated by the sort of things that happen when very different people are forced together by something.
Yeah.
So, because I think we spend so much time in our own echo chambers, both in reality and virtually as well. You know, we spend, you know, the vast majority of the time with people just like us, in one way, shape, or form. And I found myself really missing the sorts of communities that that our parents' generation used to sort of create around themselves, you know, sort of, you know, real, you know, people of all sorts of different ages and backgrounds and whatever, and that's really where, you know, what started me writing these casts of characters. And I think being in a city, you know, you see so many different diverse people, and it's sort of creating connections between them is what I really enjoy. So yeah, so that's where that came from. And in terms of how to write them all, you know, I find it really difficult to explain that without sounding completely mad.
Listen, you're among friends. You can sound as mad as you want. We won't mind. We don't judge.
So, I mean, I do literally feel like they are all living in my head, and I live with them for a very long period of time, you know, so for, you know, a year, 2 years at least. And they, you know, as I'm writing, I feel like they each jostle for position, and you pull one forward and push the others back, and then you swap them over. And, you know, I sort of take them with me everywhere. So if I'm going to a restaurant, I work out what they would have ordered off the menu, or what they would have sort of, so I become really close to them. And as I want to find out whether, you know, whether you're a plotter or a pantser, Laurie, but you know, they say that there are two types of writers: plotters who plot everything in advance and know exactly what's going to happen when and in what chapter, and pantsers who fly by the seats of their pants and sort of make it up as they go along. And I sort of fall a little bit in between the two, but when it comes to characters, I do try and leave a lot of it to just see what happens. And I find that they develop as I write them, and then I go back having learnt a lot more about them and rewrite them again. So, you know, so as time goes on, I layer on more and more and more detail about each of them. They become much more distinct in my own mind. Yeah. So is that sort of how you work, or do you do it completely differently?
No, that's exactly how I work, actually, which is really interesting. And I'm totally a pantser. In fact, the fact that you're a little bit in between makes me want to know all of your secrets, because I'm completely lost. And that is exactly what I do. I go to restaurants and and not even like as an exercise, what would this character that I've been spending all this time with order? But I have to remind myself, I'm not that person that I made up. I'm actually me, and should eat what I want to eat for dinner.
Yeah, and you know, I find it difficult to let go of the my characters as well. So it feels like I've got a very crowded head now, because I've got not only all the characters from Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting, but the characters from the Authenticity Project are still there, you know. So
I found myself thinking about which ones of them would be friends, like who I would set up from the Authenticity Project with this book, which like we could have a little crossover hit between your two wonderful novels if they could
well, there is a little Easter egg, and so there is one character from the Authenticity Project who is mentioned in Iona Iverson's Rules of Commuting, which I just put it, I couldn't help myself.
Well, And it's so wonderful. And in fact, one of the things about this book, and we'll have to try to avoid talking about it too much right now, but there are so many spoilers. I mean, there are so many wonderful surprises in this book too, which means that the plotting, you did a really good job on the plotting once you let the characters do their thing. Do they eventually start making their own decisions, your characters?
Oh yeah. I mean, actually, in the Authenticity Project, just sort of rewinding, there's a big twist towards the end, and nobody I've talked to so far, maybe they're just being polite, but nobody has confessed to having worked out that twist was coming. And I think the reason for that is I didn't know it was coming either.
Yes.
I was sort of writing away, and I got to that point, I thought, oh my God, somebody is keeping this big secret from me. And I was quite angry with them. I was like, how could you do that?
Yeah.
And I think because I didn't know it was coming, I didn't drop any clues.
Yeah.
So I sort of believe that it's necessary as a writer to be a pantser, at least to an extent, because otherwise I think it must be very hard to create surprise in the reader if there's no surprise in the writer.
Yeah. Those are my favorite moments of writing, when it is as if you're reading, when you turn the page and think, oh my gosh, I did not see that coming. And something that came out of your own brain is really remarkable.
Yeah, it's funny that, isn't it? It does feel like, I think I'd heard this before I started writing the novel, and I thought, no, that can't, that's nonsense. People talk about how sometimes it feels like it's not you writing, it's all you're doing is listening and putting the story down on paper. And I have to say that it's not always like that. Sometimes it's really hard and you're dragging the words out of your imagination. But sometimes it really does feel like you are just a conduit, and that's the very best time, isn't it, when it just sort of you can't type fast enough. I wish it was always like that.
As do I wish it were always like that. All right, so tell us about Iona, who is one of the best characters I have read recently. I loved her while I was reading her, and I also think about her a lot. Going in, I want to note, for people who are just acquiring this book, that she appears on the title page, of course, but then also in the dedication, to Be More Iona, which I just think is a lovely idea. Why don't you tell her, introduce us to her, and then I imagine, lots of follow-up questions about the decisions that you made, we think she's such a badass, and she doesn't have that opinion of herself, and that is also a really neat trick.
What I love actually is people are already using #BeMoreIona.
Hooray!
It's great, because I think we should all be more Iona.
Yes.
So Iona is she's 57, which is just a bit older than me, but not a huge amount older than me. And she is she describes herself as an it girl who's become a past it girl. So she has this fabulous backstory, which was only revealed to me in bits as I was writing her.
Interesting.
Back to the sort of previous conversation. So she was quite famous. She was one of the original it girls back in the sort of late 1980s, early 1990s. And she was given this job by a magazine which at the time called Modern Woman, which at the time was pretty modern, and her job was to go to parties and write about them, and which she loved doing.
Who wouldn't? That's a good job.
Yeah, and she had a girlfriend called B, who she married as soon as it was legal to do so. And B, now her wife, and the two of them would spend their whole time going to parties. And B actually was an actress, and so she had this wonderful sort of vivid life. But now she's got to the point where Modern Woman is struggling because it's not very modern anymore, and the new editor is desperately trying to pull it, back into the sort of, into the new millennium, and Iona is by far the oldest person left at the magazine. So, her editor is 20 years younger than her. Everybody is much younger than her. And they all think she's a dinosaur, but she knows, she's 57, she's young. She knows that she's got so much wisdom and energy, and she's got so much talent to give, and yet that one of the scenes that right at the beginning of the book, she's she's in the toilet at the office, and she hears these women discussing her and sort of debating when she's going to get fired. Which is just awful. So that's her. And she is a real eccentric. She wears extraordinary clothes, really brightly coloured, and in a world where everyone wears blue and grey, navy blue and grey and black, she wears sort of turquoise and crimson and you name it. And she goes everywhere with her little French bulldog Lulu, who even has her own seat on the train. And she carries a big handbag with her everywhere, which has everything in it that you could possibly want. So in the morning it has a flask of tea, in the evening it has ready mixed gin and tonic, and some lemon slices. So so that's Iona.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, and I want to add, not just the flask of tea, which is impressive enough, but china to drink it out of, because she's not even
china.
which detail I love. Why 57? Which I felt was very refreshing. We don't often get protagonists of books that are that age, unless that's the point. And it isn't necessarily the point here. It's just one of the points here.
Yeah, I think the reason I wanted her to be that age is because it's a really pivotal age for women, I believe, in that when men get to that sort of age and they start going grey, they sort of gain gravitas, but yes. Women often feel invisible, and they're often treated as if they are invisible, and it makes me very angry. I spent 20 years in advertising, and when I was 29, 30, I was put on the board, and I was the youngest woman on the board, and I felt like I had everything to give, and it was all really exciting. And 10 years later, I was one of the oldest women in the office. I was 40, and yet I was treated much like Iona was. I was treated like I was a bit of a dinosaur, and it's sort of, and I looked around and I thought, where have all the women gone? Where are they all? And I sort of wanted to explore what that feels like for women. And also, without giving too many spoilers, I also wanted to have a heroine who was able to create a whole magnificent second act, because I think that's what we deserve. For me, my second act was writing. I published my first novel when I was 50 years old, and I love it. It's a whole new career. It's a whole new lease of life, and that's, I wanted to write about that. I wanted to write about how it feels to be that age and how much more we have left to give.
Yes, and I felt it, and I cheered for her. I think you write such good books about. I think we write really well about things that we're pissed off about, and yes, let us avoid the spoilers. But she does have she's a remarkable character, and she's very empowering to read about, and that isn't necessarily why I think people pick up a book, like, read this book, it's going to make you feel better about yourself, it's going to make you feel empowered. But I absolutely think that's one of the things that happens here, and it's really remarkable. You did a great job.
Thank you. It's what I like playing with as well is other people's impressions of her, right. And her own impression of herself. So everyone else sees her as being, well, actually they don't all. Some of them think she's completely crazy and trying to avoid her lives, and others think she's absolutely amazing, and and want to spend as much time with her as possible. And and they all have different nicknames for her. So one person calls her the Rainbow Lady because she's always dressed brightly. One calls her Magic Handbag Lady because of all the extraordinary things that come out of her handbag. Another one calls her Crazy Dog Woman. I think it's quite fascinating, the difference between how we see ourselves and how other people view us, and that's something that I really enjoy playing with.
Yeah, and you do such a good job. And it does feel good. Well, and this is what people say about your books, both of your novels, is that they feel good, and they are, absolutely. But they're also dealing with pretty weighty, heavy stuff. This book in particular is, I mean, you're doing ageism and sexism, but also depression and anxiety and bullying and abuse. There's a lot of pretty heavy stuff going on. I want to talk a little bit about how you managed to balance feel good with this like topical, urgent, not necessarily uplifting stuff that runs through.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because you're right. I mean, people always talk about my books as being feel good, but I think it's quite hard to get the right balance with feel good fiction, because if you're not careful, it becomes saccharine and unrealistic and a bit sort of sickly, if you like. Yeah. And my view is that you can't have proper light without real shade. So, so if everything is too easy, if there aren't any issues, then there is nothing to be uplifted from. So in a way, the more, the downs have to be real downs in order for the ups to have any impact. And also, I just, for me, I write as therapy. I started writing when I was trying to get over an alcohol addiction. So this was 7 years ago. I quit drinking and I started writing a blog, which was my form of therapy. I called it Mummy Was a Secret Drinker. And that was where my writing started, is as therapy. So I still do that. I still write as therapy. I still write as a way of dealing with stuff that makes me angry, or stuff that I don't, I want to understand better, or stuff that I want to fix. So it's partly because I think it's important, but it's also partly because it makes me feel better. Yeah. It's still my therapy. If I write about ageism and I correct it, I find some way through it, it makes me feel better about my own life. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I was just going to ask, is it like the difference between writing a second novel versus a first novel versus a memoir versus a blog, whether that progression of your whether it feels like the same kind of writing or very different each time in each of those incarnations?
It's more similar than I thought it would be. When I switched from non-fiction to fiction, I thought it was going to feel very different, but actually it feels similar in that I write for the same reasons. So it feels like I'm still trying to solve problems with writing, but the difference is I'm less personally exposed. So, so when you're writing memoir, you're throwing everything onto the page. I mean, it's like taking all your clothes off in public. It's very like that. Whereas with fiction, you can cover the same sort of topics and issues, but through somebody else's eyes, which just gives you that little bit of protection as an author. So, although it still feels like it's you. And so again, just going back to the Authenticity Project, there's an addict in the Authenticity Project whose journey was much like mine, overcoming addiction. And at one stage, he falls off the wagon. So he quits drinking early on in the book, but towards the end, he goes to a wedding and gets utterly drunk. And I found that really hard to write, because I was and I found myself apologizing to him, saying, I'm really sorry, Hazard, I've got to do this to you. And I really don't want to, but it's kind of necessary for the plot. Yeah. And don't worry, it's going to be okay. So it's still, it is much closer a process, I think, than you might imagine.
Yeah. I think so. It feels like that to me. I mean, I feel that you feel and embody these characters. And in fact, one of the things, let me ask this one last question. We'll see what people want to ask in Q&A, and then maybe we can chat some more. But the thing along those lines is that strikes me is that these characters, they're very different from one another. They're very diverse, but they all want to do good. At least eventually they all want to do good. And yet they have real difficulty doing so. It's hard to do good. Um, they have a lot of barriers to that,
Mm.
um, and so though the idea is their motivations are very noble, there are other things standing in their way. Did you put them there, or do you think, for plot reasons, or are there, all of these challenges to being, to doing good in the world?
Um, I think everybody is struggling with. I think what I learned when I was going through the whole addiction thing, and then actually shortly after that, it was a bad year because shortly after that I got breast cancer, and then went through all of that. And that year, it was 2015. It was a real bugger. That year made me realize that everybody is coping with something. Everybody has some issue that they're dealing with, and we all have our flaws. And when I'm writing a character, I don't start from their strengths. I don't start by thinking, what is this person good at? I think, what are they struggling with, and what are their flaws? And then I work from there and then build the character around them. So I think that's why what you've picked up on in terms of sort of, they're all struggling with something, because I think that's my starting point. It's like sort of, okay, this character is a 15-year-old schoolgirl. What's she finding hard? How does, what does she think is her fatal flaw? What's she struggling with? What's difficult in her life? I think those things are more interesting and tell a lot. You find a lot more about people by asking those questions than by asking, what's this person good at? What do people love about them?
Yes. Yeah. What does she think is her fatal flaw is a really good way of thinking about character. That's an excellent writing prompt. You
It's
get an A
interesting.
for writing prompt.
Do you remember the days of your days of reading all the Jane Austens? And I used to I remember I used to get really fed up with characters who were just too perfect and too good, and I absolutely loved Emma, because
Yes.
she was the character in Jane Austen who just had this terrible sort of inner flaw that she was constantly sort of
Yeah.
grappling with.
Definitely. Yes.
And, but she was more lovable because of that, and more real because of that, and more human because of that. And that's the way I approach it generally.
Yes. Well, I can tell, and you did a beautiful job. A beautiful job. All right, let's see what questions people have, and then we can talk some more. Okay, so anonymous attendee wants to say, I'm curious if either of you think about characters from your different novels having conversations, and if so, how often? And if not, which ones would be friends or enemies? Which we sort of touched on, but let's do that a little bit
Okay,
more
you go
thoroughly.
first.
Oh. um, I mean, I do think about the characters after they are no longer, um, after the book is done. But I also think about what you were saying before, which is that they live with you. Like they live with you, and you take them out to dinner, and you take them on vacation, and so, um, and you, I mean, and because you are working, because writing books takes such a long time, it's also your day job is to spend 8 or so hours a day with these people. And so when the book goes to bed, it's not that I don't think about them anymore, because I still do, but they're more like old friends who I think about occasionally, who come back to me in moments. Like I think, oh, I see something and think, oh, that's something that person would like or be interested in, rather than somebody that I'm obsessing over because I am thinking about them all the time.
That's a great way of putting it.
um, do you think you'll continue to plant little characters from the previous book in the next book?
Yeah, I think it feels right. Actually, do you do this? I find that although a book ends at a certain point, I always I spend quite a lot of time thinking about what happens after the book. So, and actually, there was an interesting bit point with the Authenticity Project where there's a dog at the end who is left by himself. I'm not going to, just in case anyone wants to read it and doesn't want the spoilers. And I knew that was fine because the dog was adopted and by other characters, and I know where the dog went to live, and I know sort of
Right.
so it was all fine in my head. But of course I hadn't told that to the readers, and I had so many messages from people saying, I'm really worried about Keith. What happens to Keith? So when we did a reprint, I added a PS.
That's
Just
really
worry about Keith because this is what happens to him, and I tell people what happens to him next. So I totally agree with what you're saying about you still think about them from time to time and what sort of especially when it becomes relevant for some reason or other. But do you also sort of play the plot forwards as well? Do you know what happens in the sort of 5-10 years after the book ends?
Yes, yeah, and in fact, I do, and not only that, but I sometimes will write it and take it out because I want to end without answering all the questions, and I want to leave it on a note that is open. So, which I think that readers do find, frustrating sometimes when you're like, oh, I know the answer, I just don't want to tell you for artistic reasons. But I do think that's
But I
really,
think
really important.
has to feel like, in order for it to feel real, you as the writer have to know all the backstory, not just the backstory you're telling the reader, but everything else.
Yeah.
And I think you also need to know the forward story so that the book feels like it's a genuine moment of time, not that it's some imaginary construct that begins and ends with the book itself. So I think you sort of need to think beyond the timeline that you're writing in both directions.
In both directions, yeah, which is amazing. And I think that frequently writers' workshops and stuff want to tell you about the back direction in the past, but I think you're right. The what happens next is just as important, and it's not something that we talk about nearly as often. Yeah. Okay. Stacy says, "I love that Iona is queer. What inspired you to write a queer protagonist?" Which is a super question.
Oh, okay. I'm going to tell you something I don't really often talk about because it's sort of not my story. But a very close member of my family came out recently, and Iona is partly an homage to her. I just. And it just felt right for her character. It just felt like she's a sort of person that zigs when other people zag. She's not average in any way, shape, or form. So I didn't want her sexuality to be average either. I wanted it, I felt like it was, it just felt right for her. And it's funny, she's not, it's actually, in a way, it's almost an incidental detail. When people talk about Iona, it's not the first thing they mention about her. In fact, it's probably not even the 10th thing they mention about her. Because, as far as she's concerned, it's not an issue. It's, so, and I like that. Anyway, so that's a sort of rather long and convoluted answer to that question.
Yeah. No, it's not convoluted, and I think that's really, really interesting. That it is important for her. It's in keeping with her character. It's not like it's underexplored. I mean, she's married to a woman. Like you do the whole you do it, but it is not the first thing that you would name about her, and that is a really, I think, valuable aspect of the character, and colors the whole book in a way that I think worked beautifully, and it's really, really lovely. Okay, so another person says, also anonymous, "I loved the Authenticity Project, as did I. I did not see the twist coming. No one did. One aspect of that novel I really enjoyed was the older man's home and the physical community. I was delighted to discover that it was a real place. I looked it up and saved photos onto my hard drive of exteriors and interiors. Don't you love readers like this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. Like, all right. In this novel set on a train, are there any other? She's saying, they are saying, are there any other scenes? And how does the sense of place figure into the plot? Which is also a really lovely question.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we see each of the characters in their home environments or work environments too. So it's not all on the train. So you know what Iona's house is like, so, but yeah, the train itself is where quite a lot of the action happens. And actually, it made it really fun for me to write, because each of the characters, if you look at right in the beginning of the book, you get a little map of the train line, which is the map I drew myself when I started writing the book, to sort of work out who lived where and where they got on and where they got off. So and it shows you where each of the characters lives. So what it forced me to do was to work out which characters would meet each other when, and which couldn't be there. And and I timed how much time there was between each of the stops to try and work out how much action could happen between here and here, and for it still to be realistic. So, and I sort of find that when you create sort of parameters like that, it forces you to be more creative within them, because there's certain rules that you can't break and still make it feel real. So yes, that, to answer your question, that sense of place was really fundamental, not just to sort of, to the plot, to the characters, to the sort of the whole feel of the book. I'm glad you enjoyed Julian's house as well, because actually Julian's character in the Authenticity Project came from that house, because I used to take the number 14 bus to work for quite some time, and I'd sit on the top deck and look over the wall into Chelsea Studios, which I was obsessed by. And I used to think, I wonder what sort of people live there. And I wondered whether there was anybody who might have been there since the 1960s, and they're seeing the whole world around them change, and yet be living in this place that was sort of, timeless. And that's where Julian's character came from. His character came from the place. The place came first in that instance.
Yes, which is so interesting and very unusual. I did not know that. I feel like now I need to go back and reread it, because I did not know that.
One of the apartments in Chelsea Studios is currently for sale. I really want to buy it, but it's £1 million.
I mean, I feel like you owe it to yourself and your characters. You could write an essay about it, about how you inspired yourself to buy this house, and then that would really pay for it, I bet.
Yeah. A very expensive essay.
Right, yes, it would be a really, really expensive essay. Okay, people should ask more questions if they have more questions. Yes, somebody has put in, how much money is this house? Do you happen to know the price on the?
Yeah, it's nearly £1 million, and it's only 2 bedrooms.
Worth it though, for the story. All right, does anybody have, if you have other questions, we want to hear them. Though we could also talk London real estate. That would be super interesting. One of the questions that I had while other people are thinking of their last questions is whether you feel like this book is going to live on as a pandemic book. I feel like notwithstanding the fact that you wrote it in quarantine, that it also feels to me like, well, in fact, what it feels to me like is like the anti-pandemic book, which made it the perfect book to read at this time. I started to feel nostalgic for Commuting. I started to feel nostalgic for Strangers. I started to feel nostalgic for like human interaction that was not planned. And I wonder whether you feel like it's going to ring like that going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen with Commuting going forward. I mean, I'm not sure it will ever be the same as it was and as it was in the book, because, I think we will always from now on be more flexible about how many days we spend in the office, about what times we go in, what time, we now have this sort of technology we didn't use so much before, and I'm not sure those days will come back. And and I'm really, as a result, I'm sort of really pleased that I wrote it, because I hope it will be a sort of time capsule in a way.
Yeah.
So if we don't go back there, it will be a sort of depiction of that point in time when we didn't care about masks, when we all crowded into sort of carriages, when we felt like we had to go in every day at the same time and come back at the same time, or we would be fired. So I think it will hopefully remain a novel of the time. But there's a little nod right at the end, and it's not a spoiler because it's only a tiny detail, but I just really enjoyed it. So because I wanted to set it pre-pandemic rather than just set it for now and imagine the pandemic hadn't happened. So it's sort of set in 2018, and Piers, one of the characters in the book, right at the end talks about how it was explaining to somebody that one of his friends has suggested that he invest in this little company called Zoom. But he thinks it's absolutely ridiculous. It's a technology that's never going to catch on, because nothing can really sort of compete with a face-to-face meeting. And I just put that in as a sort of, we know, but he doesn't.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's going to be really interesting, I think, for years and years and years to come, how novelists are going to deal with and or avoid this enormous thing that happened to everyone, and that you've got to figure out how to write around or through somehow, is going to be super, super interesting. And I think you're leading the way on it.
Certainly in the UK, I know, same in the US, editors are and publishers are saying, no, we don't want pandemic books right now. Maybe in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, but right now nobody wants to read about it. So you either set your novel before the pandemic, or you set it after the pandemic and sort of pretend like it didn't happen, or you just yeah,
it's very, very interesting. Well, and that's what I think in years to come. I imagine myself 50 years from now pointing to this book, because it really is a time capsule of this right before, which is a really, really lovely place to be right now, is to go back and read about this thing that was not very long ago, but indeed the world has changed since then, which is really, really remarkable. Okay, unless anybody else has other questions, I'm going to ask you one last one. For the unless somebody wants to pop up. No, nobody does. Okay, so let me ask you your advice, I suppose, for us, for all of us, as to how we be more Iona, since it is probably not by bringing our dogs on public transport at the moment. What is your advice for us? How do we be more Iona?
Oh, well, I think it's about, and it's funny because being more often, it's about the way people view her rather than how she views herself. Although by the end of the book, she does become much more the Iona that everyone thinks she is. And that is somebody who, is prepared to be herself regardless. So she doesn't ever try and put herself in a box or to be the person that people expect her to be. She is utterly and entirely her own person. And she doesn't care whether people accept that or not. But she is immensely kind, and she really does, she doesn't care what other people think of her, but she does care how other people feel about themselves. And she is on a bit of a mission to sort of, I guess, to impart the wisdom that she has learned. So I think being more Iona is about being entirely yourself, but about caring about other people and about using your own hard-earned life wisdom to encourage other people to be their best selves.
Yes, Claire, I want you to be in charge of everything. I want to sign up for that world. I think that's like the best advice. It's really good. All right. Well, we have 3 minutes. I mean, we can keep chatting forever, but I think that Jess wanted to come back and close us out here. Oh, yep, she surely did, and there she
Hi,
is.
Jess.
Hi, Jess.
All right. Hello again. So I actually have one final question for both of you. What are you currently reading, or what would you like to suggest?
Yes.
Oh, you go first, Laurie.
I just started Alison Esbach's new one. It's called Notes on Your Sudden Disappearance, which is such a good title. And I just started it last night. It's been out for a couple of weeks. And I'm super excited to. I loved her first one, The Adults, which was maybe a decade ago. So I feel like I've been waiting and waiting. And here it is, Notes on Your Sudden Disappearance. I mean, come on, what a great title.
Oh, and I've just recently finished this one. Actually, this is the UK cover. The US cover is different, but it's called Lessons in Chemistry. Have you read it yet?
I haven't read it yet.
Bobby Gum is it's really excellent. So what I love about it is the heroine, Elizabeth Zott, is a chemist in the 1950s. And she's an extraordinary character, and she's a bit sort of, she's as unique and different, I think, as an Eleanor Oliphant, and she has this dog called 630, who is one of my favorite literary characters ever.
What a good name.
You'll understand what I mean about 630 the dog.
Okay, I'm gonna go get it this afternoon.
Oh, you'll love it.
Yeah. Oh, I can't wait.
All right.
What are you reading?
What am I reading? I'm reading, what is it? Lies I Tell by Julie Clark. Yeah, I do have it right under my computer. Yeah, I just started it like 2 days ago. It's really good so far. It's really compelling. It's about like this con artist and then a woman that is trying to take her down.
Oh.
Ah.
What's it called?
The Lies I Tell.
The Lies I Tell. Okay, good. Oh, I can't wait.
Yeah. So I'll close this out now. Just wanted to say thank you again to Laurie and Claire for giving such a wonderful, engaging conversation today, and to our audience. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this, and we cannot continue to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. So please, once again, support Claire and PNP by using the link in the chat to purchase Iona Iverson's Rules for Commuting. Go ahead and check our website for the most updated event listings, and we have a great list to choose from. We do have in-person as well as virtual still being offered. We do hope to see you all there, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you again, Claire and Laurie. Stay well read, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Claire. Thanks, Jess.